Good afternoon, Mr. Wright. Thank you for coming back to give evidence again. You're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, but first of all, you're agreeable to take the oath?
I am.
Sitting where you are, can I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth.
That I will tell the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wright. You may recollect from your previous attendance here that while we plan to have up to 4 o'clock available to us this afternoon, if at any stage you want to take a break for any reason, we will take a break. Please feel that you're in control of the situation. Now, Mr. Connell.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, Mr. Wright. Let me start with a formal question, which, as you will know from your previous evidence, everybody gets asked. You've produced a witness statement for the purposes of this inquiry. Are you content to adopt that statement as part of your oral evidence?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Now, I'll probably use that statement as a kind of guide to where we've got to in the narrative. So if we just bring that one up on the screen, please. It's at page 214 of the witness statement bundle. You indicate the positions that you held in with particular reference to this inquiry. The one that we're interested in was as Director General for Health and Social Care and Chief Executive of the NHS in Scotland for a period between February 2019 and July 2020. Now, I think I'm right in saying, and we obviously have your CV from the previous appearance, that you've also spent time as a Chief Executive of a health board. Is that right?
Yes, I spent quite a bit of time in my career being the Chief Executive of different health boards in Scotland. So Dumfries and Galloway. I was asked by the government to go into the Western Isles when it was in some trouble. I was Chief Executive of NHS Education for Scotland, which is the national body that looks after all the postgraduate education. I went into Grampian Health Board and then Tayside Health Board, and Grampian and Tayside together. So I've worked in different parts of the country as a Chief Executive.
Thank you. Now, in the next few paragraphs, we touch on what this job as Chief Executive actually means. So we go on to page 215. You talk about the job being incorporating the role of Chief Executive and accountable officer, and you refer to individual board chief executives also being accountable officers. Now, just very briefly, what's an accountable officer mean in this context?
Right, an accountable officer is defined by the Public Finance Manual for Scotland, and it involves a personal responsibility for the proper use of public funds, and it's a personal accountability to Parliament for the proper use of public funds. And as an accountable officer, both in a health board and in the Scottish Government, I had to personally sign off the accounts every year that were audited. And if there's any issues with the accounts, then I had to account to Parliament for that. And the principal accountable officer in Scottish Government is the Permanent Secretary.
I see. Now, the first point I just wanted to ask you about so we can understand it is a point you make on that page, which is that notwithstanding the title of Chief Executive of the NHS, you don't line manage health board chief executives. Now that, to an outsider not familiar with the system, might sound a little odd. They might assume that you're the chief executive of the NHS, so you control them, but that's not the case.
I am Chief Executive of the NHS. I'm also the Director General in Scottish Government. So the post of Director General in Scottish Government is directly reporting to the Permanent Secretary, one of 6 Directors General, and I have personal accountability for the use of the 14 plus billion pounds of money that was there when I was in the role. Health boards are established in primary legislation. We pass the monies to the health boards together with a very clear set of outcomes we want those boards to achieve with those resources within the frameworks of national policies and so forth. And we performance manage the National Health Service. So one of the big roles of the Director General is to ensure the performance management of the National Health Service. That is done through the board chief executive. So while the board chief executive is the employee of the health board, and I can talk more about that if you wish me to, is the employee of the health board and is line managed for employment purposes by the chair, there is an accountability whereby the board chief executive reports to me on the performance of the board over a whole range of parameters. And I think I say in the statement that the Director General had 9 directors in post, and one of those is the Chief Performance Officer for the NHS in Scotland, who played a major role in this.
The reason I ask is that we've obviously been hearing various things about the events that we're concerned with in this inquiry, and some of them indicate that material information and the like tends to come up through the pyramid and end up in the hands of the chief executive, and the role seems to be quite important. And therefore, you say chief executives report to health board chairs, and it's the chairs that are then held responsible. I just wonder, does that not create an issue if you're reliant, as it were, on the relationship between an individual chief executive and individual chairman?
Well, maybe there's 2 ways to help answer that question. First of all, the boards, which are the statutory authority. So when I was a board chief executive, it was always my view that anything that moved within the board was my personal responsibility, that I was appointed by the board. I met with my chair 2-3 times a week. So a chair is in and around the board and is paid to be in and around the board 3-4 days a week. And the board has a whole set of governance committees where reports go through the board. So the day-to-day management and governance of the board is done by the board. However, given the huge sums of public money and ministerial accountability to Parliament, the service is performance managed by me through my directors to the chief executive of the board. So the formal accountability process is one of, we'd have an annual review of board's performance in which the chief executive would be at and I would be at. We'd have a mid-year review of board performances, and that could come into some of the evidence here today. And the different directors of the Scottish Government would be constantly talking to the board chief executive and the executives within the board about different parameters of performance, and that would be brought together, and I would hold the board accountable on behalf of the Cabinet Secretary for the overall performance of the board.
I think I could probably move on a little. You've listed on page 216 the various reports that were in place at the time you held the post of the DGHSC. One of the challenges we face is trying to remember all the acronyms. So can I just ask you about an acronym that appears about halfway down paragraph 6, which is HSCMB. Now, that's the Health and Social Care Management Board. Now, does that comprise those direct reports, or are there other people on that board?
Yes, it comprises those direct reports. It was a formal business meeting, which was agendaed and minuted, met every week, same day of the week. There were other attendees, so the people who were not under my direct line management within government, so the Chief Social Worker Officer, for example, or the Director for Children's Services that was in another part of the Scottish Government, they would come along and we would look at the strategic policy development of the National Health Service. We would look at the overall performance of the National Health Service. We would look at particular issues within the National Health Service. And one of the subcommittees of that was the National Performance Oversight Group that was chaired by John Conahan, and his team would be bringing together all of the performance parameters. So that was the kind of, from my point of view, that was the key point in the week where all the Scottish directors got together. We looked at issues, we took decisions, and as I say here, the Cabinet Secretary would regularly attend, and we'd have an opportunity to talk to the Cabinet Secretary about current issues, and she would say what her priorities were. And that, of course, was supplemented by all of the directors of the Health and Social Care Management Board. We would meet the Cabinet Secretary as a team every single week, immediately after Cabinet. So the Cabinet Secretary would give us a readout from what happened at Cabinet, and we would say to the Cabinet Secretary, look, you know, we would like to make you aware of this going on in Board X, that's happening in Board Y, and this is what we're doing about it, or to lead a discussion about, you know, how we handled particular issues. So it's quite a connected system within government, I think, in that I met with my team as a team every single week. I had one-to-one meetings with them, one-to-one meetings with the Permanent Secretary. I met with the Cabinet Secretary one-to-one every single week. The team met with the Cabinet Secretary, and of course the Cabinet Secretary would ask directors to come and see her, or groups of people to talk about particular topics. So it was pretty, I thought, pretty connected.
Now, just a couple of points of information before we leave that page. A little further down, you say these meetings were in keeping with the objectives within the Scottish Government to remove organisational boundaries. That's perhaps a phrase, the explanation of which doesn't immediately spring to mind. Very briefly, what does that mean?
Right. And I'll try not to get into management speak here. But given the size of the health and social care portfolio, it was by far the biggest portfolio within government. And there was a number of things that, given the Scottish Government had set up what's called the National Performance Framework. So it's very much looking at outcomes we want to see for people in the Scottish population. And that needs different agencies to be working together. So an example of that would be that I co-chaired the Health and Justice Collaborative Board, which was bringing different justice agencies together with health, with local authorities, to think through what do we need to do to work together in communities to identify and support some of the most vulnerable people in society. So it was that sort of cross-cutting work that needs a lot of people to come together to see how do we get those outcomes. So that's one example of that.
Thank you. And the only other point, I think it probably, I don't need to get you to explain it, but near the foot of that page, you talk about meeting NHS board chief executives on a monthly basis, but in fact, you explain later in your witness statement that this was a collective group rather than the notion that you were meeting individual board chief executives on that.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And this was a formal minuted meeting between the Scottish Government and the group of board chief executives. And we'd have a lead medical director, lead director of public health, and others in attendance. So it was a pretty big room of 30, 35 people. And I would chair that with all of my directors in place and all of the board chief executives. And they would meet before and talk about things they wanted to raise with me. I would have a list of things I wanted to talk to them about. So it was a collective, monthly, formal point of contact between the government and the boards. And it also gave a really good informal opportunity to talk to colleagues about particularly hot topics.
Well, if we can move on to page 217. So we start to turn to look at the issues relating to what I'll just call the new hospital. You say basically as soon as you arrive, your predecessor makes you aware that
Yes.
the new hospital is an issue.
Yes.
And you get a briefing of what is.
Yes, and I was aware of that from my time as a health board chief executive, and I was fortunate to have some time as a handover with Paul Gray. So Paul briefed me on this, And I read various briefings that had gone to the Cabinet Secretary, that had gone to the First Minister, and I was aware, I mean, there's a whole panoply of challenges facing the National Health Service, but I was aware that this was pretty acute, pretty important. And in my conversations with both Fiona McQueen and Jean Freeman, I was very clear that this was a high priority for us in government.
Thank you. And you point out that one of the issues that was drawn to your attention was that there had been a chief executive's letter gone out to other health boards,
Yes.
touching on some of the points emerging from the new hospital issues, such as ventilation systems. And you set out the details of that in paragraph 8, and I don't think I need get you
No,
to
but we
go
were
through
keen to make sure that issues arising from the Queen Elizabeth were actively brought to the attention of other boards. So when the unannounced inspection from HIS in March came out, for example, we made sure that all of the boards were aware of that. And I think I wrote a letter to the board chief executives, and I'm sure we will have discussed that at our monthly meetings to say, look, this is what's happening here. You need to assure yourselves and your boards that you've got this stuff covered.
So, as I say, you set out in paragraph 7, 8, 9, 10, essentially your initial steps, who you was chatting to. I'm sorry, I'll take that word away. I don't mean chatting in a casual sense, but who you were engaged in conversations with on what the issues were. And I won't ask you to read through all of that. But if we can come to something that did land on your plate, which was escalation. Now, we can pick up, perhaps just shortly, what a document which has the escalation levels laid out in it. But initially, at the time you arrived, Greater Glasgow and Clyde was at stage 2.
Yeah.
Now, we will see the details later, but it seemed to me that stage 2 perhaps could be described as better keep an eye on this rather than taking a stage requiring specific direct action. Is that a fair summary?
No, I don't think it is. And the reality was that by the, as I came in post, and certainly what I can attest to since I was in post, there was a very considerable amount of time, energy, support going into this issue. So I was aware that Fiona McQueen, who's CNO and also the policy lead for HAI and infection prevention and control, she was in regular contact with the board, with the chief executive of the board, that as issues were arising, as infections were being reported, she was mobilising Health Protection Scotland, Health Facilities Scotland. So actually there was a lot of support going in. And just thinking about that in advance of this hearing, the level of support probably wasn't quite at level 3, but it was certainly moving in that direction.
Thank you. So if we just deal with we'll deal with the formal step, and then we'll come to how that was achieved. You say in paragraph 12 that NHS GGC was at stage 2, or perhaps lurching in the direction of being described as stage 3, and you took the decision to escalate to stage 4. Now,
Yeah.
I think we can see from your witness statement, when I say you took, that's because the decision maker for that purpose was the person holding your post.
Yes, that is correct. A level 4 escalation is a decision for the Director General. I took that decision, and I take responsibility for that decision. And I took that decision on the advice of the Health and Social Care Management Board.
Yeah.
A movement to level 4 is a serious step. It has a whole set of ramifications. It carries some risk with it, and it is a balanced judgment. And it was normal practice within government that the initiation of recommendations to escalate and de-escalate would come from different directors around the Health and Social Care Management Board table, quite often the Chief Performance Officer, but in this case it was the Chief Nursing Officer because she was the policy lead on it. She talked to me about it in advance. I talked to the Cabinet Secretary about it. And on the basis of that advice and on the basis of Fiona's paper, I took that decision and I take responsibility for it.
Well, I don't think we need put up on the screen the formal letter that you then wrote to the Chief Executive of the board. But can I just ask this? I mean, this was November. The letter was the 22nd of November. One of the questions that inevitably arises is, with the benefit of hindsight, could it have been escalated sooner? Have you any view on that?
Yes, I do, and I've given that a lot of thought in preparation for this hearing. One part of me thinks, you know, if that team had been in 6 months ago, we would have, you know, got to some of the granularity of this more quickly. Another part of me thinks, what was the information coming out of the board that was pertinent here? So if we look at the board's annual review, which was carried out in March, 11th of March, where the Cabinet Secretary and I and directors from Scottish Government, we have the best part of the day with the Health Board. We have a private session with the Chair and the Chief Executive. We have a public session. We meet the area clinical forum. We meet the area partnership forum. We meet patients groups. The outcomes of that review are confirmed in writing. And the Cabinet Secretary's letter, I think, fully reflects that we had a robust discussion with the board because we'd had the water reports, we'd had the unannounced HIS inspection coming forward, and we were not content. And we really held the board to account and said to the board, we need you to get on top of this and to manage this situation. And the Cabinet Secretary says in her letter that she was assured by the board, and that is my recollection, that strong assurances were given by the board that they were fully committed to seeing these issues through, and that we could be assured by that. I think the other thing that happened around about that time was that the Chief Executive, Jane Grant, had announced her own set of reviews. That's mentioned in the letter, and I think she was going to chair an overall program board, and I think there were 3 reviews going on about patient flow, about clinical outcomes, and about the environment in which patients were being treated, and that all of that work was to go ahead. So that was a pretty important point, because that was the government publicly holding the board to account and receiving the assurances from the board that we know that this is a serious situation. We need to get to the bottom of it. And I guess from my point of view, just thinking back and thinking, what were the points along the way that moved us into a position of escalation to level 4? And I think there's probably 3. I think I believe Fiona McQueen is giving evidence, but I think her meeting with Dr. Peters and Dr. Inkster, and her telling us about that, and the challenges of team working within the infection prevention control team, I thought that was significant. I think the Cabinet Secretary and the CNO meeting families at the end of September, and while I wasn't at those meetings, I talked to the Cabinet Secretary, I talked to Fiona McQueen, and really some of the feedback that we were getting from families was really very, very, very concerning indeed. And on the back of that, the Cabinet Secretary appointed Craig Wright to go in, and my interactions with Craig Wright, he was very much reinforcing that families were feeling that they were not being communicated with well, they were not being engaged with well, and they didn't feel a sense of confidence that what they were being told was actually the full story. And I know that in October, Cabinet Secretary and CNO met with Professor Cudahy, and again, that feedback, I think, the meetings with clinicians, the meetings with families, and I think the third thing that really struck me was, I think, around about the 15th of October, we received the ACOM report, which I know the inquiry has seen. And my reading of the ACOM...
Sorry, I just didn't... On the 15th of October?
15th of October, we got the ACOM report, AECOM report. And that was the report that had been commissioned, I think, by Greater Glasgow and Clyde, looking at the building and the deficiencies of the building. And I read that, and I thought, you know, a combination of what the clinicians were saying, what the families were saying, and what we were getting in writing pulled together about the building and what that was going to take to get that to a better place. I think those were the kind of three main sort of turning points in my mind. So I think there's a period of about 4 weeks from that all happening to actually escalation taking place. And then I think we had the whistleblowers going to their elected representatives and really highlighting cases going back to 2017 that we didn't know about. I'm not sure that the board knew about. And I think there's a combination of all of those things linked to a loss of public confidence that certainly led me to the conclusion, and I know it led the Cabinet Secretary to the conclusion, and Fiona McQueen to the conclusion, that we have to sort of cross the threshold and get in there and put a very senior team in there really very quickly indeed. So in a nutshell, those were the main things that got me to that point and why I got to that point.
I probably should know about this, Mr. Wright. Towards the beginning of your answer to Mr. Connell, you mentioned the GGC annual review.
Yes.
Now, it's just that I don't recognize that. Perhaps I should. So what is it?
Okay, this is part of the process of the government holding boards to account. Mm-hmm. So every health board has an annual review with the Cabinet Secretary, with the Director General, with some of the directors from government, the Chair, the Chief Executive, and it's a big set piece event. It's organised in advance. The whole of the performance of the board is brought together for that, and the board is challenged by the Cabinet Secretary about, you haven't done that, or that's not good enough, but you have done that, and that is really good, and you're to be commended on that. So that is a formal set piece event every year where boards are held to account. And one of the things the Cabinet Secretary and I did together was to put in place a series of mid-year reviews, which were less formal, but involved the Director General and the Cabinet Secretary getting the Chair and Chief Executive Board in a room and having a conversation about various performance issues. And that mid-year review for Greater Glasgow and Clyde happened on the 24th of October. And I know the inquiry's got a copy of that letter, but I think it's interesting to note that letter from the Cabinet Secretary confirming the 24th of October was written in January, because we then very quickly escalated the board and we met with the whole of the board after that. So,
right.
Answers.
So the reference to the GGC annual review is reference to a process as opposed to a document.
There is a document in the inquiry's papers, I think, that contains the letter, the formal letter from the Cabinet Secretary to the Chairman of the Board saying, had your annual review, we met the Area Clinical Forum, the Area Partnership Forum, we had a private meeting, and there's a substantial section in there about infection prevention and control, and it lays out the Cabinet Secretary's expectations, and the Cabinet Secretary says, you assured me that, dash, dash, dash. So that's maybe worth...
Thank you. It's gone.
Just so we should clear about the timing of these events, did I understand one of your earlier answers to indicate that the annual review with the board, the one in which various assurances were given and so on, took place in March
Yes.
of that year, and then the half-year review, the smaller gathering, took place in October. Is that right?
That is correct.
In your witness statement, obviously you set out a lot of the things that, in fact, you've touched on, discussions with the Cabinet Secretary, Chief Nursing Officer probably being the sort of driver behind a lot of these issues, because her responsibility included infection prevention and control. And that matter then came before the group that we discussed earlier, this board on which they all sat. Is that right? And they reached a conclusion with which ultimately you agreed to take that step. Is that so?
Yes, and I'm the decision maker for levels 3 and 4. And I do that on advice of the Health and Social Care Management Board. And of course, I will speak to the Cabinet Secretary before coming to that decision.
And just so we have it, I think if we could just have bundle 52, volume 1, page 34. I think you said you had a paper from Fiona McQueen. Is this what we're talking about here?
Yes, it is.
And I don't think we need openly, in a sense, to read through all of it, but does it set out the kind of points that you've indicated?
Absolutely, and I think she succinctly stated what the issues were, and the reason for escalation being around the systems of infection prevention and control at Greater Glasgow Health Board, and how patients were engaged and communicated with. And I think she explicitly says that at that point, there was no evidence of a wider systemic issue at Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And the recommendation was that it should be escalated to level 4 for this very defined purpose. I think later on in January, we escalated the board more widely to level 4 because of other performance issues. But this was a very concise and precise intervention that we were going to make in the health board on those two major issues.
Yes. Well, let's just see how this document is set up, so we can see what's in it. The front page, of course, is the one at which it is suggested that a particular step be taken. The board is asked to consider escalation to level 4. That's the board being that committee, if one likes. And we see if we just go on to 35, that's just the end of that section. 36. One then sees, I think, a fuller narrative.
Yeah.
And that essentially makes up the remainder of the paper that was placed in front of you. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. When you were having these discussions before, during, and immediately after that meeting, was there any degree of dispute about what you should do, or was there a consensus?
There was no dispute about what to do. I talked to the Cabinet Secretary about, and she talked to me about, should we go to level 5?
We'll come back to that later, I think.
Sorry?
We will come back to
Okay.
the question of level 5 later, but yes, so.
But in terms of this recommendation, it was unanimous from the Health and Social Care Management Board that was the course of action to be taken. And of course, I had that conversation with the Cabinet Secretary before we took that decision. And I would never not do that, because as soon as that happens, the Cabinet Secretary has to go and give evidence in Parliament, has to make a statement, and it becomes a very, very public thing. So while it is my decision, clearly I would have that conversation with the Cabinet Secretary before doing it.
Yeah. I was interested in a phrase that appeared in your witness statement. So if we just take that document off screen at the moment, we go to page 220. In the course of narrating the different considerations, some of which you've already mentioned in evidence, the information coming back from Professor Wright and so on. In paragraph 17, you say this was leading to rising levels of concern about the extent to which NHS GGC had a proper grasp of the issues at the new hospital. Is that a summary of where you thought you were?
Yes, it is, and that's not to say we were not being regularly reassured by Greater Glasgow Health Board that they were working on this, and there was a lot of activity, a lot of work taking place. But I think there was a pattern of, so I think if you step back from it, I think there's a pattern of there's an infection problem arisen there, we'll put in the appropriate infection prevention control mechanisms, would have that in Scotland over it, action would be taken, that would be closed off, then something else would happen over here and something else would happen over there. And as time elapsed, there were many of these coming forward, and a sense of, have we really got to the bottom of this? Have we really understood what the underlying issues were? And in my conversations with Jane Grant and John Brown, and I can't remember the date exactly, my lord, but I visited Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board and spent some time with the chair, the chief executive, with the executive team. I saw aspects, physically went and saw aspects of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. I got a strong sense from them about their commitment to seeing these things through. But I think there was a pattern of things happening, things that had happened quite a long time ago, suddenly coming to light, and thinking, we haven't got to the bottom of this yet, and we need to get to the bottom of this. So, and I think when the ACOM report came through, and to get that sense of, this is the building that we've got, and these are the deficiencies in the design commissioning of that building, there was a sense of actually a lot more work is going to have to be done, and a lot more public money is going to have to be spent getting the building to the place that we need it. So it's not, and I think Fiona McQueen's feedback to me was that the board, it's not that the board weren't doing anything, they were working extremely hard. They were responding to issues as they arose, but the issues just kept on coming. And I felt that a threshold had been reached whereby we needed to take action and actually cross the threshold of the board, if you like, and go in with a transformation team.
What I wanted to ask as a follow-on to that, because if we go on to page 221, we see you referring to the fact that the Cabinet Secretary has to make a statement to Parliament, and then she writes to the relevant committee and so on. You then go on to say, well, we created an oversight board. Now, again, looking from outside, one might immediately think that the oversight board are running things, not NHS GGC. And that might, on one view, coincide with the sort of public perception of the government has stepped in, words to that effect. Just help me understand how it was thought that an oversight board which didn't directly take over was intended to work.
Yeah. The oversight board carries very significant authority from the Director General and the Cabinet Secretary. And the Chair and Chief Executive knew this, and they recognised it. Level 5 is the stage where the government comes in and says, we're running this and we're taking accountability for it. And I think it's really important to be clear on boundaries, because where does legal accountability lie at any point in time? So level 4, the legal accountability for the delivery of safe, effective patient care services lies with the board as a statutory body. And what the oversight board is doing is it's going in with a very senior respected person And on the back of that, further people going in who are senior and respected, but also people who've got a skill set that allow them to work collaboratively with both the board's management and senior clinicians along the lines of, we need to get to the bottom of this. And I don't think that the chair and chief executive of the health board were in any doubt that if they chose to be obstructive, if they chose not to give information when it was sought, there would be a series of consequences for that. And Fiona McQueen's feedback to me was that she got the cooperation she needed, she was able to do her work, she got the information that she needed, and we never needed to do that. But the chair and chief executive would be in no doubt that if Fiona McQueen came to me and said, look, Malcolm, I've asked for this 10 times, I'm not getting it, I need you to phone the chief executive, I would phone the chief executive and say, this is what I need you to do. And I know from my time as a board chief executive that you don't get calls from the Director General very often, but when you do get them, actually it's about something very significant, and it's coming from the Director General and the Cabinet Secretary. So the Chair and Chief Executive recognise that. They're both experienced people. So I don't think it arose in practice. So I think it's really important, because I don't think the government coming in and saying, we're running this bit of it, but we're not running that bit of it. I think that is a recipe for chaos and for things falling through the cracks. So, the board is either in statutory charge of its business or it's not. Level 4 is somewhere in, they're still in charge, but they're being directed, and I use that in not a legal direction way, but they are being really, with the authority of the Cabinet Secretary and myself, we are going to get to the bottom of this.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because on page 222, the phrase jumped out at me on my most recent reading. Near the end of paragraph 22, both the Oversight Board and its subgroups were intended to be a vehicle to rigorously manage. Now, at least on the face of it, an oversight board that doesn't have any power to, technically at least, to instruct anybody to do anything, might struggle to rigorously manage the process at first glance.
Yes, and perhaps I could have worded that differently, but I think they were rigorously managing the business that they were set out to do under their terms of reference. And they were having challenging conversations with colleagues in the board about what was emerging, what needed to be done, but there was no point in which the statutory authority for doing those things did not lie with the board.
And that, as I understand from your statement, is in part because you were focused on a particular area of board functions centred around the new hospital, as opposed to all the other things that the board was doing, which at that point were not the main focus.
That's right. I mean, the board, I think, had something like 35 hospitals that had mental health facilities, primary care, and that wasn't the focus. The focus was infection prevention control systems and engagement with families. That was the precise focus of what we wanted to see improvement in.
Can I just then pick up and make sure we're understanding another thing that you mentioned, which is mentioned on page 223. Now, I think you did mention it in the context of an earlier answer, the National Planning and Performance Oversight Group.
Yeah.
How does that fit into the picture we've been discussing?
Well, the National Performance Oversight Group is a group within Scottish Government that is chaired by the Chief Performance Officer, who at that time was John Conahan. And it was his job and his performance colleagues' job to pull together all of the performance parameters of the board and to present that to myself and to the Cabinet Secretary to say that, say, take Dumfries and Galloway, the board's doing really well on here, they're on track here, here, and here, they're really under some pressure here. We need to help them with that particular aspect. So it would give an overview of a board's performance so that we could say to the Cabinet Secretary, look, this is where we are with this board. And, do we need to escalate them? Do we need to de-escalate them? So John and his performance colleagues, working with all of the other, directors across government. So the public health portfolio would play in, the integration portfolio would play in, to give that overview of a board's performance. And that reported to HSCMB and to me.
You may have in part answered this question. If you look at page 224, you set out the terms of reference, the things that the Oversight Board was intended to do, ensuring appropriate governance was in place, strengthening practice to mitigate avoidable harms, etc., etc. So if they encountered difficulties, challenges in getting done what they wanted to do, did they have any power of enforcement to ensure the thing was done?
Well, I think there's one set of powers in terms of ministerial directions. And actually, we don't want to get to that stage unless we absolutely have to get to that stage. I think what I was trying to convey was that this Oversight Board carried the authority of the Cabinet Secretary and the Director General. So if the Oversight Board wanted a piece of information, wanted to go and speak to particular clinicians or particular staff, I would not expect them to encounter resistance from the board. And if the board was saying, back off, this is none of your business, then actually there would have been follow-up action with the chair and the chief executive of the board. I think in this instance, the chair and chief executive very, very keen to get the board de-escalated in time, and certainly from the chair's point of view, very keen to assist the Oversight Board. And I know he met with Fiona McQueen on a regular basis. So there's a sort of important technical point there. Did the board have the power to direct? My answer to that would be we absolutely made sure it never needed to get to that, and that the boards understood that the performance framework is a dynamic system and it can go up and down. And just because we've escalated the board for that doesn't mean that if there is evidence arising over here for that, we can't widen the escalation. And in an extreme event, I could make a recommendation to the Cabinet Secretary for a level 5 escalation. And in an extreme event, a Cabinet Secretary would get a chairman of a health board in. And if she was not content with the chair's performance, she would hold him to account. And there were examples in other parts of Scotland where, chairs resigned on the back of those sorts of conversations. Now, you try not to get to that position. But, there are things that would be done to make sure that the board did cooperate with the Oversight Board.
I think that's very clear. Could you just help me with, you used the expression widening the escalation. Now, what I understood from that answer was you were looking at a situation where the board has been escalated to stage 4. There remains the option for restating the basis of a stage 4 escalation. Was that what you're referring to by widening?
That's a very good way of putting it, my Lord, and which I hadn't considered. But yes, it's changing the basis of the escalation. So, in January of the following year, John Conahan came forward with a paper saying that a number of performance parameters in relation to waiting times, access targets, and other pressures, and there is a letter in the papers, in the inquiry papers, outlining that. So the basis of the escalation was widened appropriately. And I think we saw some of this happening in Lothian, that when you've got something of the order of what was happening in the Queen Elizabeth, it is clear that senior management time and energy and attention is going to be focused on sorting that out. and therefore the time and energy and focus they can give to other aspects of the board's performance, like waiting times in A&E or you know, waiting times for operations and for outpatient appointments, they can't have the same amount of focus on that. So they need more support in another area of the board. Does that help, my lord?
It does.
Well, let me just ask you then about the possibility of a next stage, or consideration of a next stage. If we go to 225, you essentially asked, well, did you think about going to stage 5? What about going to stage 5? Would that have been better or worse? And you described that as the most exceptional circumstances only to go to stage 5. Is that right?
Yes, and it's laid out in the guidance about what are the parameters for a stage 5 escalation, and those parameters, and allow me just a moment. Those parameters talk about the most exceptional circumstances, and they talk about a level of dysfunction across the board's activities that requires ministerial intervention. And it also says that stage 5 shouldn't be seen as these are my words, shouldn't be seen as a logical next step from stage 4, because we always wanted to get boards down the level of a ladder of escalation rather than up the ladder of escalation. But it really was would have been a very, very serious move to make, and one we would have made if the circumstances warranted it.
Was it an option you looked at when you did the stage 4 decision?
Yes, it was, and it was an option that the Cabinet Secretary discussed with me. And I think by that stage, the Cabinet Secretary was hugely concerned and exercised, rightly so, about what had emerged in the ACOM report. But I think her involvement of going and meeting the families face to face and hearing firsthand what those families were describing to her about how they felt they had been treated. I think Fiona McQueen's engagement with the clinicians, and I think with the whistleblowers going to their MSP and highlighting cases in November and highlighting cases that I think went back to 2017, the Cabinet Secretary was hugely exercised by all of this. And my observation of working with this Cabinet Secretary was she took her responsibilities to Parliament and her accountability to Parliament extremely seriously. And she said to me, should we not go for level 5? And we talked about that. My advice to her, my best advice, and I can only give my best advice, but my best advice was that I think we need to get in and around the infection prevention control system and the engagement with the families. We need to move quickly, and we need a team in place, within a matter of days to get that. Because one of the things that really exercised me during this time was that as all of this was emerging, and as those whistleblowers came forward in November, public confidence in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital was being severely eroded. And if you put yourself in the position of a patient or a family about to go into that hospital, reading all of that in the press, all of this that has come out, and you think, am I going to be safe here? And it's really important that the public of Scotland correctly believe that the hospitals that they're going into are safe. So for all of those reasons, I think having that very targeted approach on level 4, in my advice, was the best thing to do. If the Cabinet Secretary had said to me, look, Malcolm, hear all of that, but I still want to go to level 5, we would have done it. No question at all. But level 4 is the maximum the Director General can do. Level 5 is a ministerial decision, and level 4 does not preclude, as you've said, my lord, a redefinition of the basis of the level 4 escalation, and it doesn't preclude moving to level 5. And I have found, because I've been personally utilized by government on a number of occasions to go into boards that have been escalated on a level 4 where a chief executive has moved on, you cannot avoid understanding the culture of the board. Because to me, it's human behaviors, it's human interactions, it's teamwork that are often at the root of these problems. So it's quite possible when you go in on a level 4, you go in to look at that, and you see something else and you think, my goodness, we need to take further action here. So level 4, in my advice to the minister, was the very focused, immediate thing that we could do, but it did not preclude the minister from moving to level 5 if she wished to do that.
Let me just ask you now then, while we're on this theme about some of the possibilities. As you say, level 5 is the drastic one. Is essentially, as I understand it, it's regarded as taking over the health board on the part of the government. Is there any scope for suggesting that something less than that might be a useful tool? Because clearly, as you say, some areas might be quite happily going along, others might not. You've got this level 4, which is intervening but not controlling, and then you've got level 5, which is taking over everything.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether you have any views on whether that's too inflexible, whether options in between ought to be available to the Cabinet Secretary.
Or options in between that are kind of quicker. I suppose it is always within the gift of the minister to ask the chair to move on. And then I think comes the question of the chief executive, and the inquiry heard on the Edinburgh leg of this inquiry, advice we sought about the removal of accountable officer status for chief executives. So if I do my best to explain to the inquiry, if you're a board chief executive, there are 3 appointments you've got. One, your contract of employment is with the board. So the employing authority is the board. Your terms and conditions, your annual performance review, your personal development plan, your challenge is done between the chairman and the chief executive. The second appointment is from me as the accountable officer. So I have to have confidence that the accountable officer is qualified and capable of fulfilling those responsibilities. And that is why the Director General is usually on the appointments panel of Chief Executive of a board, because they have to be appointed as accountable officer. And if, I think Stephen Lee Ross's advice that we saw in the Edinburgh part of the inquiry was the processes that would need to be gone through to remove accountable officer status, and that is quite significant, and I think it's laid out in Annex 3 of the Public Finance Manual. So, but that's not a straightforward thing to do, and it's quite narrowly focused on financial responsibility for financial resources. And then the third appointment one has is that the Cabinet Secretary writes to the Chief Executive and appoints you as a member of the board. That's a voting member of the board. So those are the 3 appointments. And I conclude from your question, because I've thought about this, and if the question is directed towards removing executive members of the board, all of those executive members of the board are employed by the board. So that includes the medical director, the director of public health, the director of finance, and so forth. And I think government powers to remove that are intrinsically linked to where these folks are employed. So you could say...
Sorry, I just missed that last sentence, entirely my fault.
Sorry. I was saying it's intrinsically linked to who employs these folks. So the board employs them. The board is the statutory accountable authority. And you could say, right, somebody else is going to employ the chief executives. That changes the whole dynamic of the board, because the point of having a statutory authority with a range of governance in place is that the board holds them to account. So if they're thinking that they're actually reporting into the government, that's a different dynamic. And I'm not sure that Scottish ministers would wish to directly employ chief executives. So there are pros and cons to different.
I'm just trying to explore possibilities with you, none of which are probably fully formed. But I suppose what I'm trying to suggest is there might be circumstances in which the government thought that part of the problem, or whatever.
Sorry, could you just...
Part of the problem might have been the chairman. Now, the way you dealt with that was to say, well, the cabinet secretary could ask the chair to go. Yeah. Can the cabinet secretary, well, one possibility is the cabinet secretary should have power to remove the chair. Let them ask them to go. Another possibility might be if it was thought that the chief executive was part or all of the problem. A mechanism could be put in place by which the chief executive could be removed and a new chief executive appointed by the board, not to be appointed direct by government. These are possibilities, perhaps intermediate possibilities. I wonder whether you had any thoughts on.
Yes, I think government determining that an executive director of the board is the problem is pretty problematical from employment law perspective, because I think all employees of the National Health Service have got contracts of employment. They've got we have an obligation to honour those contracts of employment, and taking precipitative action to try and get a chief executive moved on. Somebody could well say, well, this is not fair, and an employment tribunal could result from all of that. So I think one needs to be quite careful about it. I think in those circumstances, all chief executives have their performance reviewed by their chair every year. All of those performance reviews in terms of where they're placed on the scale come to government. So government takes an overview about who's performing well, who's performing less well, and I would certainly have no difficulties in having a conversation with the chairman of a board to say, look, we have some concerns here, and can we have a conversation about it, please? But that falls short of, I think, what you're maybe hinting towards.
Well, I suppose what I'm trying to think about are the possibilities. If stage 5 is a fairly drastic one, under which the government in effect takes over, anything short of that, removal of a chair, removal of a chief executive, removal of all the executives, leaving in place perhaps the non-executives, or indeed removal of the board and making new appointments, might be options short of that ultimate step. I don't know whether you've given any thought to that.
Well, I have, and I think my best advice is that I think it is linked to who employs the chief executive. Is it the government, or is it a statutory body? And I don't have a legal training, and if that was to be explored, I would want to take legal advice on that. But that's my best sense of it. I think it is linked to where these folks are employed, and I think it's linked to their employment rights. And I think somebody from an external body saying, time's up, move on, I think that raises all sorts of legal challenges to the board, who are the employer, about was that conclusion arrived at reasonably and fairly. So I think it's problematical.
Mr. Wright, remind me, and again, I should know this, the members of the board, the members of the health board. Now, as I understand it, some of these are appointed directly by the Cabinet Secretary. Am I right in thinking others are nominated by, for example, the local authority?
Yes.
Right.
And still appointed by the Cabinet Secretary,
Right.
but nominated by the local authority. And the same applies to the employee director, who will be nominated by the trade unions and will be then appointed by the Cabinet Secretary. So all of the board members are appointed as board members by the Cabinet Secretary.
But the local authority has the nomination role and might have views about their nominee being removed.
Exactly so.
Sorry, Mr. Connell.
No, that perhaps illustrates the issue. I suppose I'm envisaging a situation in which an issue arises, it's thought to focus in perhaps one or two areas of responsibility, and a cabinet secretary says, well, I don't want to remove all these people who've been nominated or appointed by me. I just need to appoint another group, and it causes all kinds of problems, but I really don't think A, B or C should remain in post, given what I've had reported to me. At the moment, you see that as being problematic because of their employment right. That where we've got to.
Yeah, because they're employed by a different authority. However, if I or the Cabinet Secretary had concerns about the performance of a particular chief executive colleague, I wouldn't want to leave the inquiry in any doubt that I would have conversations with the chairs. So, for example, one of the things I did every year on behalf of the Cabinet Secretary was to do the performance appraisal of the chair. And, part of that would be, how is he chief executive? What are the challenges? What we need to do? So there are ways into this that I would have no hesitation to take if that was what was necessary.
Can I just ask you another point sort of along the same theme? One of the issues that has been mentioned by some witnesses was that when the oversight board was in place, there was a lot more reporting having to be done by people in NHS GGC, and this was burdensome for various reasons, however understandable. If you have I suppose the question, if I can formulate it correctly, is if you have a very large organisation, could a situation arise in which more reporting would actually be helpful, as opposed to might not be helpful to those having to do it, but might be helpful to the recipients? Can you see that as being a possible?
It may well be, but I would give that fairly short shrift. I think if you're running a multi-billion-pound organisation and you're saying this is too much work, I would say that's the least of your problems. Really, really, that's the least of your problems. And secondly, I had and have full confidence in Fiona McQueen that she would go about her role in a way that was sensitive to the way in which the board operated. She would be very clear in what she wanted. She would work collaboratively, and we would try and minimize the reporting requirements. But when you send a level 4 team in, of course there's going to be reporting requirements. And Fiona, I think, very helpfully set up a number of subgroups to look at different things. So of course that is going to generate work. But if it didn't generate work, it wouldn't be doing what we wanted it to do. So that is a risk. There are a number of risks of sending in an oversight board. Confusion about who's in charge and who's making decisions. And I think, given the skills of Fiona McQueen, I was never in any doubt that she would be able to manage those through, and she would command the confidence of not only the management but the clinical staff of that board, and I believe she did.
Let me ask you another question. Again, we're staying broadly with a theme. Culture might be something that's influenced by those near the top of an organisation.
Yes.
In these circumstances. Approach general matters of that kind, attitudes and so on. Now, in your witness statement at 236, we may come back to some other things, but if we just go there for the moment, you asked a specific question, which I suspect may have come from one of the participants, which says, is there a risk that because day-to-day running of the board remains in the hands of the board, issues of institutional culture can't be addressed, and then the phrase is without the full cooperation of the board and its senior officers. Now, let's leave aside for the moment people being actively obstructive. How do you deal with an unsatisfactory culture in a situation of that kind?
Yeah. And to answer your question, I think I would fall back on my experience as a board chief executive when I was asked by government to go into the Western Isles, to Grampian and to Tayside. And in each of those boards, so you take the Western Isles, the presenting problem was a massive financial overspend. Actually, beyond that, you very quickly got to the point about how does this organization run? What's the culture like? What's the leadership like? And it was the same in Grampian, and it was certainly the same in Tayside, where the presenting problem was financial overspend, lack of financial control, charitable funds being allegedly used for revenue expenditure and so forth. And you very quickly, because going into a board, you talk to people, you interview people, and you very quickly get a sense of what's the culture here. And I've always had in my mind the phrase that culture trumps strategy every single time. And I've always felt that one of the most important parts of a chief executive role is to lead and manage the culture of the organization. And you do that by example. You do that by how you chair your management team meetings, how you walk about, how you interact with clinicians, the things that you value and the things that you don't value. So in the Glasgow situation, I would value clinicians. I would value clinical voices. I would value clinicians who were whistleblowing, who were not happy. And just because people are whistleblowing and that is a threat to the organization, my sense has always been to surround myself with people who are very bright and who will tell me things sometimes I don't want to hear. So I think it's about having a culture that encourages people coming to you and saying, look, Malcolm, that's not right. And while you're at it, you need to understand that, and that. And having a culture that doesn't punish people for giving you bad news, I think that is absolutely essential. And I look back to what happened in Lothian Health Board many, many years ago, where there was a huge scandal about their waiting list. Culture was at the heart of that. And you had people, different layers of the organization, not being prepared to report of bad news because they were afraid of the consequences upon them. Now, my sense is if you're going to get the best out of an organization, you need a culture where you report that coming through. So I was shocked when I read the DMA report. And I was shocked for two reasons. One, the content of it, but I was shocked because it said something about what was going on in that part of the board. The colleagues felt able not to report it up, not to follow it through. And it said something to me about how's the estates department working with the infection control people? How is bad news getting reported up the line? And what's that culture of kind of openness and a sense of, you're not going to be hung out to dry if you give me bad news. You're going to be, you'll feel my critique of you if you don't give me the bad news. But if you bring me bad news and say, look, we found this out, it's not happening, then I will respect that. And I always find as a board chief executive, that if something was going wrong in my board, one of the first things I'd do would be to phone somebody in government and say, look, you just need to know that that's happening. This is about to hit the press, and this is what we're doing about it. And you don't have people blindsided. And I suppose what I saw coming through here was regular things coming out of the woodwork that had not come out of the woodwork before. So I think when a team goes in, culture is one of the first things they come across. They can't avoid it. And that has to be part of the diagnosis of whatever problem the board is facing. That'd be my perspective as a board chief executive.
That's very helpful, as it touches on a range of issues that this inquiry has heard about. I just want to ask another question in the same connection. I mean, you said, what was it, culture trumps strategy every time. Another kind of phrase sometimes crops up, which is that people don't learn unless they accept they were wrong in the first place. One of the witnesses we've heard from recently was Professor Bain, who was obviously inserted into the board to deal with a particular aspect. And one of the things that perhaps jumped out of her witness statement to us was that she said that she got the very clear impression, having talked to senior people at the board, that they didn't think there was any need for any of this.
Yes.
So in other words, they were doing what they required to do because they didn't have any choice, perhaps, but they didn't think there was any necessity for the interventions. They didn't need the help. Now, would you regard that as an obstacle to making progress?
I'd regard that as a clear symptom of the culture of an organization. So while it might be perceived as a problem, it would just double the determination of myself and the cabinet secretary that we're going to work through this. I mean, I've gone into boards in the past. I remember going into one particular board I won't mention, where the first reaction was, "This is unfair. We're really being badly dealt with here. The government's being really unfair to us. They don't understand all the work that we're doing." And actually, you get them to open up about that, and you understand that there are huge problems that they're grappling. We're not trying to blame them, but our focus is on getting things right for patients. That is the only focus. And if the culture is one of defensiveness, then that's a red flag for me. And if I may be allowed, my lord, when I worked at Great Ormond Street Hospital, my boss was an ex-Third Sea Lord of the Admiralty. He trained as a barrister. And he taught me that if there's something wrong under your command, you report it, you own up to it, and you get it out quickly, and you then respond to it. And that lesson has always been with me. So if that is being encountered, that's a big red flag to me about the culture of a board.
Let me ask you an associated question. In your witness statement, you were asked one or two questions about the case note review, which was part of the process that was being put in place. I'm calling it through the oversight board, because the case note review, I think, reported technically to the oversight board. Now, I appreciate that you weren't necessarily in post by the time all of this came out, but the case note review.
Sorry, when you say when it all came out, you mean the publication date of
the publication date of the findings of the case note review?
In March 2021.
March 2021. Yeah. Yes, I apologise. This is dealt with in So we have it for easy reference, paragraphs 51 to 54 in your witness statement on page 231 and 232.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not actually going to ask you the direct questions that are here to which you've given answers, but when we asked Professor Bain, who was the sponsor of the case note review, about aspects of it, she described its principal conclusion as the one that said that 30% or thereby of patients had probably received their infections as a result of the environment. And why was that the principal conclusion? Because that was the ask. That's what they'd been asked to go and do. We've had some evidence, and we're probably going to get a bit more about what the reaction of the board was to the report from the CNR that 30% were probable links to the environment and a larger number were possible. And we know what the board said as a public statement. I suppose what I'm keen to ask you, and you can assist or tell me if you can't assist, is if the board had responded to that CNR conclusion, that principal conclusion, by saying, well, that's your conclusion, we don't agree with it at all. We don't accept that 30% or anything like that is down to the environment. And that had been their response. Can you help us as what the likely consequences of that would have been if that had been their position in response to this act of the Oversight Board?
Well, and given I wasn't in post when the report was published, and I'm not fully conversant with all of the circumstances, but if that was the position, and I was advising the cabinet secretary, I would say, well, why? Why? So if we've got a UK expert who I think did the Morecambe Bay review, who I think was sourced by the Chief Medical Officer, you've got 3 eminent people who are external to Scotland. You've got clear terms of reference. They've been through individual case notes. Now, a case note review is not a novel way of doing things. We've always done case note reviews, and if you really want to understand what has happened in the care of individual people, that is a well-rehearsed way of going about it. And if you've got 3 eminent people coming in saying, we've done this and we've come to that conclusion, I would expect the board to accept the recommendation, accept the conclusions and recommendations of the case note review. A, because of the seniority of who is doing it. And I caveat that by saying, well, tell us why you're rejecting this. But I'd also expect it because of the perspective of the parents. If your child has been, you think your child has been the subject of harm, the one thing you want to know is what happened to my child and who's going to accept responsibility for this. And given that causation is a hugely complex thing, and understanding all of that, I've read the case note review, but I have not been involved in the discussions to date. I would think that if you were really wanting to engage with the parents, you would not say, we're not accepting any of this. I find it very difficult if the board, if I've been there and if the board said, we're not accepting any of this, I would find that very difficult. And I think that would prompt advice from me to the Cabinet Secretary about what we need to do.
Is it unfair to ask you what the options you might put to the Cabinet Secretary in that state of affairs, where the board has explicitly rejected the conclusions of the case note review?
Well, I certainly wouldn't put any advice to the Cabinet Secretary until I'd fully understood why. And I would be asking the Chief Medical Officer to speak with the board, to speak with the medical director of the board, and to understand why. And to me, it would need to be a pretty high bar as to why the board wouldn't wish to accept that. So I'd want to understand it. I think the Cabinet Secretary would want to understand it. She would want to understand the clinical perspectives and just get a rounded picture of it. But I think if the Cabinet Secretary came to the view that this was a robust piece of work and that the board, for which I have accountability in Parliament, is refusing to accept this, then I think there would be consequences in terms of conversations that she would have with the chair of the board, with the non-executives of the board, and with her overall confidence in how the board was operating, I would guess. But I'm speculating, and I know you're inviting me to, and I don't want to say things that I don't have knowledge of because I don't.
Well, I can see it's a speculation as to what actually would have occurred. Maybe not a speculation, assuming the facts that we put to you as the hypothesis, not a speculation as to what advice you would have given. And I've got your want to know why. Speak to the board, Chief Medical Officer of the board, to understand their thinking, because you would regard rejecting the CNR, which I think you said you'd read.
Yes, I have.
Yes, would be a high bar.
I think so. I mean, I'm not medically qualified to
No.
pass a judgment on the quality of the CNR report, but I've read it as a former DG and Chief Executive of the Health Service. I think it is a robust piece of work, but I was not in government when it was proposed. So yes, I would want to understand that. And I guess if it was the view of the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Nursing Officer, of Marion Bain, it was the view of the chair of the review that this was a credible, robust piece of work that parents are needing to know the answers to. I think there would be a holding to account of the board by the Cabinet Secretary in those circumstances.
Thank you.
And I suppose, just to follow up his lordship's theme, I mean, a holding to account sounds very nice, but does that actually mean? What would happen? Would heads roll or what?
I really don't want to speak because it would depend on the outcome, but I would be in no doubt that the Cabinet Secretary and Director General would have a robust discussion with the Chair and the Chief Executive of the Board. If I was there, I would certainly involve the Chief Medical Officer in that. And we would see where we got to with that. I don't want to speculate on what a Cabinet Secretary would wish to do in those circumstances, but it doesn't lead to good outcomes.
Thank you. I just have a couple more questions. One, NSS Assure, which, as you point out, in a sense, emerged in something approaching its current form, and in part due to the events at the new hospital. Now, this may or may not be in your area of expertise. Knowing what you do about that emergence, do you think it has enough powers to stop things happening in the future?
I've been retired for 5 years now, and I know that things have moved on considerably since I retired. And I think I gave evidence at the Edinburgh part of this inquiry, where we had a very clear and immediate case of thinking, okay, one thing, something else happened, and the need for externality at different stages of the process to assure not only the government but the board that we are getting what we think we're going to get, and that national standards have been applied. And if there are derogations from national standards, there is a clear audit trail, and those derogations have been cleared with an external authority, an external expert authority, because the Scottish Government, Cabinet Secretary doesn't have that level of technical expertise, but we need to have an organisation that does. And I think when I read through the history of the Queen Elizabeth and read the ACOM report, and just the gaps between what we perhaps should have had and what we did get, I would strongly support the need for NHS Assure, but I don't know in detail where that's got to, because I'm not involved anymore.
Thank you. I think the last question I have for you at the moment, at least, is probably a fairly open one. That I mean, we have your witness statement. We can see the way you've dealt with various of the questions there, and I'm not going to ask you to go through all of that. And we have perhaps taken advantage of your presence to ask you for your thoughts on a variety of possibilities on which you've offered views. Do you have, in light of your knowledge of the content of this inquiry, any additional material that you would like to suggest to the chair that might be helpful in going forward?
Yes, and if I could, I've given this some thought as well, and I want to be helpful to the inquiry in terms of what I've learned over the years, and if this is O-level management to colleagues in the boards, I apologise for that. But I've maybe 5 quick points I would make, and happy to answer anything on any of them. One is NHS Assure, absolutely, but we've covered that. Secondly is the centrality of infection prevention control, estates, and frontline clinical staff working together. And I want to make a comment later about systems of management and general management models. But I've learned over the years that to listen to clinicians very, very carefully. And in some parts of the NHS in the past, and I think this is a feature of the worst of the NHS trust system, where management was put in charge and authority over a lot of doctors. I've always been of the view, and I've learned this at Great Ormond Street. I've learned it at NHS Education, that actually if you're a consultant in the National Health Service, you will have done 5 years at medical school, 2 years of foundation training, and another 8, 9, 10 years of postgraduate education. You are regulated by the General Medical Council. So your behaviours and your patient-centeredness is absolutely in the core of what you've been trained to do. So even when clinicians have said to me things I didn't particularly like, or they've said them in ways I didn't particularly like, actually they're worth listening to, because they've got that level of experience and they know things that I don't know. And I apply the same to nursing staff in terms of their undergraduate and postgraduate education, to pharmacists, to physios and OT. And I undertook a Churchill Fellowship a number of years ago, and I spent some time in New Zealand, and I learned the adage of healthcare systems being clinically led and enabled by management. And the management role was one about making things happen rather than this is what you're going to do, which is an old type sort of stereotype. So I think the importance of clinicians working with estates colleagues, and certainly in my time, and we did a lot of work to address this, but estates have an absolutely central role, and them working with infection prevention control, and that's really the heart of it. So the third point, I think, leads from that, and I think that's about the boards' professional advisory structures. Every single health board in the country has got an area medical committee, an area nursing and midwifery committee, an area clinical forum. And these are bodies that are down in regulation, that every board has to have one. And I've always found them hugely important conduits of clinical opinion within the system. And I've always met, and I'm sure colleagues at Greater Glasgow and Clyde do this as well, but I've always made a point of engaging very closely with your area medical committee, your area nursing committee, because you find out stuff about what consultants around the place are seeing and what their views and opinions are, and you can triangulate that with what you're getting through the formal line management structures. So I think that clinical leadership, I think the professional advisory structure is hugely important. Fourth point I would make is about when you build a new hospital, and it's easy to focus on the build. Well, it's not easy, but you can focus on the building and what a fantastic £800 million development we're getting here. It's going to be really, really fantastic. But actually what you're doing is you are engaging in a huge set of organizational changes, because you're bringing teams of people together who work in different parts of the system. And you almost need to put as much work and effort into how these teams, these new teams in a new environment, going to work together in practice. And you might have had perceptions from, the same clinical environment, but working in one part of the city to another part of the city, they're suddenly brought together, and there's all sorts of tensions come out, and you actually have to invest in the organizational development part of all of that, and you need to do it well in advance of the building opening. And I think one of the things that Marion Bain did from memory was to institute organizational development within the infection prevention control team, and that's absolutely what's needed. Then the final point, my lord, I would say that boards need to make sure their systems of management are fit for purpose. Now, a system of management in Greater Glasgow will be different from Tayside, from Grampian, from an island board. And boards are very different. So there's no one size of management that should fit all boards in Scotland. But I think that board governance systems need to check that their management systems have got clinicians in the middle. We're hearing clinical voices. There's teams of people working together. And what we value more than anything else is not protecting the organization, but protecting patients. And that if you come forward with something that's bad news, we're going to bring that on. We're not going to punish you for it. So, all of that, are our organizational management systems actually fit for purpose? And are they supporting the delivery of healthcare, or do we need to do something about that? So that would be 4 or 5 things that I would say to the inquiry that it might be worth thinking about.
2 questions from that, Mr. Wright. The first, when you talk about the importance of listening to clinicians and the integration of clinicians within the management structure, am I right to understand you mean not simply people who at one stage in their career have qualified as doctors, but people who are currently engaged in providing clinical services?
Exactly so, my lord. And having a consultant in specialty X being a clinical leader of that part of the organization, but also I think there's huge benefit in that consultants still doing outpatient clinics, still doing operating theatres, if they can keep their practice up, and that connection with patients, I think is hugely, hugely important.
Second question is, although I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the text in front of me, the terms of reference of the inquiry envisage that the inquiry will look at the provision of a safe environment for patient-centred care. Now, inevitably, both from the terms of reference and the way the evidence has emerged, in thinking of a safe environment, we've had to think about physical environment, particularly ventilation and water systems. But listening to you, I'm becoming confirmed in a view that a safe hospital environment certainly involves the physical infrastructure, but it also involves the way the services are managed,
Yes.
the way there is internal or how internal communication among those responsible for the services work, how communication with patients and families work, and how the confidence of both current and potential patients is maintained
Yes.
is all part of providing a safe
Yes.
environment for patients. Am I understanding you correctly?
I think that's exactly so, my lord. And I think the two are equally important. So how clinicians work together, how the team working goes, how they collaborate across different clinical disciplines, how they work together to get the best outcome for patients. And I think where there are problems, so one of the questions is, how do we sort out disputes in this organization? How do we sort out where there's discord in the organization? And it's, is that a sort of top-down, you're going to do this because we expect it? Or is it, how do we bring people together? We explore differences and we look at what do patients want, and we create an expectation that we will work together. And it's an absolute organizational expectation that we will work together, we will get these outcomes for patients. And actually, if there are colleagues who don't want to do that, then we'll have those conversations separately. But I think, and I've learned over the years that, the management of performance of a board, but your waiting list targets, your A&E targets, that can be reduced to numbers. It's really important. The management of the money, that's really important. The management of the building project, that's really important. But just as important are how are these highly trained clinicians coming into an environment that they feel supported, that they can work together, they can have disagreements, they can work things through. And actually, if they want to say something that is not can be welcomed by management, it's okay to do that. Because if this affects patient safety, I want to know about it. And we're going to work through it and make things happen. So I'd say, the kind of right-hand side is just as important as the left-hand side. And I think the key skill sets that I've always looked for in chief executives are people who could do the right brain stuff and, your TTG targets and, outcomes and put numbers down and hold them to account. But you need to be able to do the left-hand side stuff about how do we create the organizational environment where people can flourish. If you've done 15 years of medical training, you don't want to go into a job where you're feeling, you can't express your views, that you can't advance your clinical practice. And these are hugely experienced people we've got in our organizations. They're an incredible resource. And I think if you support them, you can get really good outcomes for patients. So, sorry, that's a long answer, my lord, but I apologize.
But a useful answer.
Can I just ask you one question, having listened to your points, and see if you can help at all? One or two witnesses, when asked about this committee or that committee, in the context of what we've been hearing in this inquiry, said, "Oh yes, health service, lots and lots of committees, arguably too many committees." And I have in mind a piece of evidence in which a witness, we'd had some evidence about different layers of committees on a particular topic, and we had a particular witness, and I said, we've heard about Committee A and Committee B and all these events, and we haven't had either committee actually do anything. They've received reports and they've passed on reports to other committees, but we haven't actually heard of them taking any action. And the answer was, well, that's not what they're there for. They're simply to provide oversight. I'm not sure whether you recognise that picture from your time in the health service.
I believe John Brown is going to be giving evidence next week, and I know he's done a lot of work on board governance, and I hope he would agree that the role of the board committee is not just to seek assurance, but is to ask challenging questions. So, you know, say a board gets an HIS report and it's got things you're doing well, it's got things you're not doing well, and you know, you need that report brought to you. You need it with a cover paper saying we're going to do this, 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 and this, and that's the sort of that's the right brain stuff. The left brain stuff is about, okay, how are teams being worked with to make sure that we actually really in practice, you know, put this into place. So I think board committees are really important. I think the board's infection prevention control committee is absolutely essential. And it needs to be asking those hard questions. And it's not for things for noting. Things need to be escalated there. But I think, you know, Greater Glasgow Health Board, I think that's something upwards of 30 people sitting around the board table. And I've looked at the CVs of those colleagues. I mean, there's some pretty senior, experienced people. I think how a board chair deploys those non-executive directors, not just to receive papers coming through and saying, yeah, that's okay, and go and do that, but actually those non-executive directors to get in and around the system, to do walk-arounds in hospitals, to go into clinical environments, to talk to clinicians, so that that soft intelligence can be brought through, as well as the hard-edged, this is in a report, here's an action plan, and this is what's red, amber, and green. So I think I've always believed in triangulation of intelligence. And, you know, to go back to the Gulf War, not stovepiping of intelligence, you know, triangulation of evidence. So the hard evidence coming through, really important. But I've always wished in my career to triangulate that with, well, I'm going to spend a morning in a set of operating theatres and get gowned up and talk to people. Or I'm going to do a walk around this particular ward, or I want to meet that group of clinicians. Now, in the Board of Great Glasgow and Clyde, it's a huge thing to do, but it's how, as a chair, you deploy that expertise to make sure you're getting the soft intelligence through and the things about culture and leadership where the blockages are, as well as the hard intelligence.
I have no further questions, my lord.
But you may wish the opportunity to check with the rest of the room. Mr. Wright, if you could bear with us for no more than 10 minutes so that Mr. Connell can check whether there's any other questions that should be answered.
Okay.
If I could invite you to return to the witness room.
Thank you.
Yes, Brian?
Mr. Connell,
I have what I hope is one question.
one question. Perhaps one further question.
I'm just trying to formulate the correct version of this question. In your witness statement, you spoke of concern over whether NHS GDC had a grasp of what was going on. And you mentioned, I think, in your oral evidence, things were popping up here, things were popping up there. It turned around, something else had popped up. You remember mentioning that. The point I've been asked to raise with you is this, that the former chief executive, Jane Grant, gave evidence, and I'm told, said that when something cropped up, she focused on what had happened, looking forward, don't look back, don't investigate back, focus on looking forward only. Now, I suppose the question is, could that have contributed to the fact that things kept popping up? Because you're simply looking forward, you're not looking back at the root cause.
Well, if Ms. Grant said that, then I understand what she was trying to say, in that if if a series of infections has become apparent, you absolutely need to get on top of it quickly with your infection control people, with your medical director, with the help of HPS. And of course, you've got to be proactive, and of course, you've got to look forward. But I think what I found of value, and I think what we found of great value in the Edinburgh leg of the review, was the reports that Ms. Freeman commissioned to say, let's just understand, go right back to the beginning and understand what we thought we were going to get, what we actually did get, what we thought we were going to get. Did that meet extant standards at the time? If not, why not? And what we've got, is that what we thought we were going to get? And to understand the full panoply of issues affecting, my personal practice would always be to try and let's get this stuff out now. Let's get it out and understand it. And if that's hard and it's difficult, it's better we get it out now and we understand the breadth and depth of what we've got to deal with. And then we can, that's not to say we're not going to deal with things as they come up, but it gives us the perspective to say, actually, this is the size of the task that we've got here, and we need to go about this in a systematic way. So I think you've got to do both, would be my
You got to do both.
best advice.
Okay. Thank you. I have nothing furthermore.
Thank you, Mr. Connell. And thank you, Mr. Wright, for your evidence today. Second time you've come to the inquiry. Thank you for that. And thank you for the obvious careful preparation of the evidence that you've given. It will be helpful to the inquiry, and I'm appreciative of it. However, you're now free to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, that's the end of our proceedings for today. We will resume again on Tuesday of next week, again with you, Mr. Connell?
Yes, I'm returning again with Mr. Calderwood.
With Mr. Calderwood, and that, I think, is scheduled for 2 days.
That is so.
All right. Very well. Can I wish everyone a good afternoon, and we will see each other, all being well, on Tuesday.
Please stand.